Welcome to the podcast for Chapter 5. The textbook, in the textbook, the chapter, the title is Drug Use, Access, the Supply Chain, and the Role of the Pharmaceutical Industry. So here we're going to talk about companies that make the drugs per se. As we go through this particular podcast, you need to know that there are 26 slides. We will be covering questions and answers to nine IRAD questions, so please jot those down. As we go over this, there are essentially 7 learning objectives, and we'll address each and every one of those. To begin, let's just talk about drugs. You see there the definition of a drug. It's substances that produce a change in the cellular or physiological functioning of humans. The manufacturers focus on the drug's therapeutic effect with goals of optimizing biochemical activity, increasing specificity, and limiting negative effects. A prescription is a medication requiring a prescription by an authorized, licensed healthcare provider. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight from the textbook is the term pharmacon. Maybe you read that when you read the chapter, which means, and this will be an IRAD question, what is a pharmacon? Well, the possible meanings for the term pharmacon are remedy, poison, or a magical charm. So all of those, remedy, poison, and magical charm, are used to describe pharmacon, and that's where pharmacist come from. Non-prescriptions are medications available to the general public without a prescription. They may have some restrictions. They're also known as over-the-counter. It's important to note here that sometimes prescriptions, when they're first marketed, because there's not much testing, relatively less testing of drugs that are in the prescription category when they're first marketed, if they are deemed after some time to be more safe, they may very well switch over into the non-prescription category. So, for example, some of the H2 antagonists, you're going to get to know these better next year, for like ulcers, like cimetidine, ranitidine. These were brand new prescription drugs back in the 1970s. But they were deemed so safe that now you can actually walk into a pharmacy or even into a 7-Eleven and buy it over the counter. Approved use, a medication or indication officially recognized by the FDA for marketing, and an unapproved use is a medication or indication without FDA permission for marketing it that way. So one of the terms that you're going to come across, and again, this won't be an IRAD question, but you need to understand that the FDA will approve the information that pharmacists and other healthcare practitioners can share about a particular medication. However, there may be some kind of unapproved use that is not approved by the FDA, and doctors can still use it for that unapproved use because they can prescribe for unapproved uses. Maybe they want to try something out, even though it isn't approved for that. The doctor can write for it, and you, the pharmacist, have to fill it. You may have discussions with that about that issue as you are dispensing medications. Medicalization is the redefining or relabeling of a personal or social problem as a medical condition, thus necessitating treatment in the healthcare system. So where there have been mental health issues that have been considered like an issue with the way that they do things in society, the way they behave. But if it's medicalized, then they treat it like a medical condition, and it necessitates treatment in the healthcare system. A lot of mental health issues, like I don't know, schizophrenia might be a good example, were one time considered something untreatable, but it now is considered treatable. Conditions with physical pathologies that also have complex mental, emotional, and social processes include anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, and eating disorders. There's the consumer's perspective. Consumers' beliefs are often very different from the beliefs held by healthcare professionals. There may be a lot of discussion between consumers and healthcare professionals, like the pharmacist. Perceptions of current or potential symptoms, along with their social knowledge of health, may suggest whether a health problem exists. Possible actions taken for a perceived health problem are to do nothing or take action, like beginning self-care or seeking the care of the physician. So oftentimes, pharmacists are considered a gatekeeper for decisions on what to do. Now, an IRAT question, you will see when you go to take the IRAT, has to do with consumers' choice to act. So the question is, how often does a consumer choose to take action when faced with a health problem? And if you read the textbook, that part of the textbook chapter, you'll find out that the answer is 2/3 of the time. So 2/3 of the time, when faced with a health problem, they'll actually choose to act on it. Usually has to go with the severity of the issue. Consumers' perspective, continuing this discussion. Pharmacies are the source of most drug products for consumers. In 2008, over-the-counter drugs, 35% of them came from pharmacy, 29% from mass merchandisers, 21% from food stores, and 15% from other, like vending machines. Reasons often cited for choosing a particular pharmacy are convenience and price. The prescriber's perspective, drug therapy is a mainstay of prescribed treatments by physicians. Right or wrong, prescribing has a ritualistic component between physicians and patients. Enhances and solidifies the interaction as a symbolic component to healing. It provides a sense of satisfaction to the patient by reducing uncertainty and frustration, by reinforcing the physician's power to cure, and it fulfills an ingrained need or habit to take action against illness. Also, with the prescriber's perspective, that's the physician's usually perspective. Factors influencing prescribing behavior include their education, their training in pharmacotherapeutics, and their preceptors' prescribing habits. So back in the 70s, when I was a pharmacy student starting to work at different hospitals, you could pretty much perceive where a doctor was educated because their training may have been very different, and their way of prescribing was very different. Nowadays, it's more homogeneous, the education that physicians get all over the country. Colleagues or other healthcare professionals can have an effect on what they prescribe. There's control and regulatory mechanisms. I suspect that a lot of doctors are trying to constrain their prescribing of opioids due to a lot of the things going on right now. There's demands by consumers and society, and there's promotional activities by drug manufacturers. We'll actually get into that more later, especially in your ethics section about these promotional activities, which are sometimes suspect. The dispenser's perspective, that is you, the pharmacist, typically, as volume and regulatory pressures have mounted, pharmacists have less time to perform patient services other than dispensing. Now, that's pretty much the way it was in the 70s, 80s, and starting to get into the 90s, but that's changed more recently. Dissatisfaction with the situation is partly responsible for the rapid changes seen in the profession. Now, late 90s, now into the 21st century, we have a lot more pharmacy technicians, we have robotics, and we're starting to see more clinical activities that pharmacists do with computerized monitoring and patient counseling. So the upshot of this is you're going to see an IRAD question about pharmacists' time filling prescriptions. And I'm talking about now in the 21st century. And I would say that pharmacists tend to spend less time filling prescriptions than they used to. Drug development. There's regulation of pharmacy practice and professionals is mainly at the state level, but regulation of drug products and medical devices occurs at the federal level with the Food, Drug, and Administration. So keep that in mind. When you're talking about drug products, you're talking about federal law. When you're talking about pharmacists and other professionals practicing, you're talking about state law. It's because of the state's police power in the Constitution of the United States. There's two main acts are used by the FDA to control pharmaceuticals. There's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which applies to small molecules and hormones as well as drugs, and the Public Health Service Act, which applies to biologics like immunizations. Now, one of the IRAC questions asks you about small molecule drugs, and there, in that particular IRAC question, they'll ask you under what act does the FDA regulate small molecule drugs? And that, like on the slide, is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So bear that in mind. Moving on, we're about halfway through the podcast. Continuing with the discussion of drug development, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, their functions are pre-marketing clearance of all new products based on purity, safety, and effectiveness. They regulate labeling and advertising. They regulate good manufacturing practice and recalls, if necessary. Regulation of bioequivalence standards, post-marketing surveillance for unanticipated problems after approval. So once a drug is marketed and is out there for just about anybody to take, you as a healthcare professional, if you see something unusual, you report it to the FDA, something called MedWatch. And if they see enough of these unanticipated problems coming up, they may recommend to the manufacturer to pull it from the market. And monitoring of the blood supply. The FDA keeps an eye on tainted drugs. Continuing with drug development, once a drug is approved for the market, the FDA has few powers to determine how it is ultimately used. So again, I can't overemphasize this off-label or unapproved uses. Non-FDA approved off-label indications are uses of products that were not approved by the FDA but have been shown value after approval based on post-marketing research. Non-FDA approved indications cannot be promoted by the manufacturer. So if a doctor, like let's say an internal med doctor, sees that a particular drug that is not advertised or not approved by the FDA for diabetes, they think that it does a good job for some particular patients with diabetes. They may talk amongst themselves and say, hey, I've used this for elderly diabetic patients and it works really well. They can essentially tell each other, all the doctors, that it works, but it's not approved. Now, when a doctor writes for something like this and it's called an off-label use, doctor, you will probably end up calling the doctor and saying, hey, what is it about this drug? It's not indicated for this particular use. What's going on? And the doctor will usually explain this is an off-label use of the drug. And you'll have a discussion, and then usually you'll end up dispensing it. But you might want to note on the prescription or in the computer that you had this discussion with the doctor to cover your behind, so to speak. There's the drug development process where you do some preclinical research. This is bench research. It identifies potentially useful compounds. You often see this not only in drug manufacturing, but you also see it in schools, colleges of pharmacy, where they do this type of bench research. There's some going on our 5th floor of our pharmacy school. There's preclinical testing, which involves animal testing. We don't do animal testing at our school of pharmacy, but some schools do. Clinical testing on humans, 3 phases prior to approval. And then a new drug application, an NDA, new drug application is submitted for approval. And that's when the FDA gets involved. It looks at all this testing and the data, and a panel decides whether to approve it or not. Here you see drug development to get one approved. So you see these different stages. On the far left, you go from potential candidates through preclinical testing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's the FDA approval. And then there's the approved drug, and there's some phase 4 studies. Typically, the practicing pharmacist only gets involved in that phase 4. So if they see something going on with their patients, they would report it through MedWatch online. The length of these stages varies. As you can see, typically it's about a year or 2 years. The patients, note how when it goes from phase 1 to phase 3, more and more volunteers, subjects, they call them. They don't call them patients at clinical testing. They're called subjects, not patients. But you can see in phase 3, it gets up to 2,000 or 3,000. So they're testing to see if, like, the safety of the drug at that stage, whereas earlier they're just seeing if it works, if there's any problems with renal function or hepatic function. I'm sorry, I mean kidney and liver. So the number in the stage dramatically goes down, as you can see there. Clinical testing, this is an important slide. You need to know these phases. She'll probably have another professor talk about them. But in phase 1, it determines the safe dosage range, preferred route of administration, mechanisms of absorption, distribution, and elimination, and possible toxicities. So again, it's the pharmacology of the drug here, the administration, the distribution, the metabolism, and excretion. So if you have, the faculty here at the School of Pharmacy involved with medicinal chemistry and such, they'll talk a lot about this, the pharmaceutic aspects of it. At phase 1, you have healthy volunteers. It lasts about a year. Phase 2 are the safety and efficacy in treating a disease or symptom. You have volunteers with that disease or symptom, and it lasts about 2 years. Phase 3, safety, efficacy, and dosage range under market conditions. Again, you have a lot more volunteers, 2,000 or 3,000 in phase 3. And it can last up to 3 years. Typically, it may be 1 or 2, but it can last about 3 years. But you will see an IRAT question about this slide, and I want you to focus in on phase 3, because in that phase of clinical testing, there are thousands of patients that enter the study. There's quite a bit fewer in phase 1 and phase 2. Approval. The sponsor submits a new drug application to the FDA. The FDA has 62 days to decide to review or refuse for completeness. If approved, the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research reviews. There's 10 months for routine, 6 for priority reviews. It inspects the manufacturing facility for cleanliness, sterility, and so on. May deny or request more information required. If approved for market, the manufacturer continues to submit post-marketing information. Phase 4, including clinical trials on subgroups. Sometimes drug manufacturers suppress this information and they get in trouble. A supplemental NDA, if a new indication, labeling, and change or a new manufacturing procedure is requested. So, for example, you may have physicians who have been using a particular drug entity for an off-label use. They may be talking to the drug manufacturer about, hey, maybe you should have this included as a new indication because we think it will work, and the manufacturer will submit a supplemental NDA. Drug pricing. It's the suggested price determined by the manufacturer. It's usually a different price, much lower than is actually paid out of pocket by most consumers based on their insurance plan. Those without insurance are most likely to pay the full price. So there's something called the Red Book that if you work in a pharmacy, like during your IPPs or your APPs, you'll see the drug prices there. You may want to get acquainted with the Red Book. Continuing on drug pricing, price is ultimately determined by costs and profits of supply chain plus any discounts and economic forces. So there's the manufacturer's cost. They want to have some profit. Research and development is incentivized, meaning that if the manufacturer didn't get reimbursed for this, that they probably wouldn't want to do any research and development. There's the wholesaler cost and profit between you and the pharmacy. They want to have a piece of that profit. Retailers' costs, like the pharmacist and their profit, they want to get something out of it. There are discounts and there's supply and demand issues. And again, when we get into the last section of the course, we'll talk about more about supply and demand and how that affects costs. Research, productivity, marketing, and costs. There's direct to consumer or DTC advertising. In 1997, the FDA allows DTC provided adequate provision of information requiring fairly balancing risks and benefits. So if you watch some of these commercials on TV, of course, they fly through a lot of the side effects on what could happen if you take this drug, but they do have it. Research requiring DTC shows mixed effects. One study reported 40% of physicians believed it was positive, 30% negative, and 30% no effect. The pros: educate consumers about conditions and symptoms. Cons: it increased promotional expenditures, increasing the price of the drug. It should be noted that only in the United States and New Zealand is direct-to-consumer advertising permitted. So, for example, if you cross the border into Canada and you're watching TV over there, you won't see these like Cialis commercials or some of these biologics. Most countries feel that if these commercials are aired on television, people watch it, it will be interfering between the patient and the physician, their relationship. I, on the other hand, kind of agree with the America. I think it helps us to spur some conversations between consumers and their pharmacists and their physicians. Importation. Again, we're getting close to the end of the podcast. Reimportation concerns include safety and effectiveness, bioequivalence, fraud, counterfeiting, patent infringement. So these are all concerns about folks getting their prescriptions filled outside of the United States. The FDA requires inspection of supply chain for approval for legal importation of products, drugs, regardless of the country of origin. So, for example, I take Lipitor, a generic, and it comes from India, and the FDA requires inspection of the supply chain for this particular generic drug. The FDA bans reimportation of drugs for resale, parallel trade through unapproved sources. And you have to be careful. Sometimes patients go online and they may order something like Viagra or Cialis, and all the drug manufacturer is doing is finding like a drug that's similar to the Cialis or the Viagra in shape, and maybe they're just spray painting it to a blue color. That kind of thing really does go on. So they need to be careful when they're ordering drugs online from offshore sources. Personal importation of a 3-month supply is allowed, provided a person can produce a valid U.S. prescription from an authorized U.S. healthcare provider. The intended use of the drug is unapproved, and for a serious condition where effective treatment may not be available, and the product is not considered to represent an unreasonable risk. Now, be advised that a lot of pharmacy students don't realize this, but if a drug is only available, let's say in Europe, some country in Europe or Asia, the doctor can get a hold of that drug and give it to their patient, but they have to go through the the FDA. That drug from another country that isn't approved in this country is considered a Schedule 1 drug, an experimental drug, but when the doctor gets it, they give it to the pharmacist, and you may have a special supply of something for a patient of yours. Counterfeiting, the prevalence is pretty high, 30%. Counterfeits are 30% of the global drug market in the developing world. That's going to be an IRAP question. So what percent of drug sales in the developing world does the World Health Organization estimate are counterfeit? That's 30%. There's consumer risk. They receive no benefit from the drug when there's no active ingredient. Like I said, you may have something you think it's Viagra, it's blue, it's about the same shape and everything, but maybe it's some inert substance, and you're getting no benefit, and you paid a lot of money for it. Experience adverse effects, including death from drugs with harmful and toxic chemicals, and they delay access to effective treatment. And now we switch to foreign trials. Approximately 40 to 60% of trials occur outside the United States. Clinical trials among diverse sites allow for diverse populations. There are concerns the FDA is not equipped to inspect a large number of foreign trials. There can be difficulty in attributing differences in patient outcomes among the various sites. Different sites can have different standards, limiting the ability to interpret the data. Now, I will say, and this won't be on the IRAT, but if you have these large multinational corporations like Pfizer, a lot of the drug testing may occur in other countries like Germany, and maybe they aren't as much under as much scrutiny by the FDA as maybe some of the other countries, maybe a third world country, and I'm not calling it out, but maybe Brazil may be suspect. Intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights are laws and regulations to protect ideas and products of innovators. IPRs for small molecules are regulated by the Hatch-Waxman Act. These are senators from, I think Waxman came from California, I'm not sure, Orrin Hatch from Utah. Patent protection, and copies considered generics. There's also IPRs for biologics. These are regulated by the Patent Protection and Affordable Care Act. These are rather new. There's data exclusivity, and there's copies considered biosimilars. So there's actually a case scenario for Chapter 5 where the group is considering biosimilars or making it. An IRAC question for this particular slide, the last IRAC question, involves that issue of data exclusivity you see there towards the bottom of the slide. And what I want you to know for that IRAC is that data exclusivity periods for small molecule drugs are 5 years long. And they're also 12 years long for biologic drugs. So that means that another manufacturer cannot use that data for those periods of time. And that's the end of this particular podcast.